For the first time in about a century, we're seeing a reversal that would have sounded unlikely not long ago. More people with U.S. passports are quietly moving out than coming in. Curious, I'm not talking about tourists, students on a semester abroad, or retirees sampling a beach town for a winter. I'm talking about families pulling their kids from American schools and enrolling them overseas, mid-career professionals relocating their work lives, entrepreneurs and parents deciding their long-term plans may lie somewhere else. Thoughtful. If you look back to the Great Depression, you don't really find a modern parallel to what the numbers are hinting at now. Residency permits for Americans in other countries, foreign citizenship applications, and international university enrollments are all telling a similar story. A growing group of Americans is choosing to reset their lives abroad. On paper, falling immigration into the U.S. and higher deportation numbers are sometimes framed as a policy success. But when you step back and focus on the people who are leaving voluntarily, a different picture appears. These are not individuals being forced out. They're opting out. And when citizens of one of the richest, most influential countries on earth start to feel that their future might be safer, more stable, or simply less stressful in another nation, that raises some big questions. Is this mainly about politics? Is it about money and cost of living? Or is it something deeper? A change in how Americans see their own country and their own prospects? Some commentators have started referring to this as the Donald Dash. The label itself is less important than what's behind it. I'm Artur from Global Visa Guide, and in this video we're going to look beneath the headlines. Not the talking points, not social media arguments, but the measurable demographic patterns that suggest something significant may be underway. This is not about one viral story or a handful of people posting pictures from a beach in Europe. It's about data, real decisions people are making, and the long-term impact when families, skilled workers, and business builders decide their opportunities might be stronger elsewhere. We'll walk through the numbers, the behavior patterns, and the motivations that are driving this movement. Then we'll talk about what it could mean for the future of the U.S. economy and society, especially at a time when leaders say they're worried about falling birth rates, labor shortages, and long-term growth. If Americans are leaving in the largest numbers we've seen in the modern era, that's more than a lifestyle choice. It's a signal, and signals like this usually appear for a reason. Before we dive in, a quick note. This video is for education and information only. It's not financial, legal, tax, or immigration advice. Always do your own research and speak with qualified professionals before making big decisions about money or relocation. Let's start with the basic challenge, proving that more Americans are actually leaving. One common objection you'll hear is, where's the hard proof? And that's a fair point. The U.S. government does not track every citizen who moves away in a comprehensive, centralized way. Systems that once did some of that were largely wound down, so there's no single official counter showing emigration in real time. When you can't observe something directly, you look at the indicators around it, and right now, a lot of those independent indicators are pointing in the same direction. Since the pandemic, multiple countries have reported sharp increases in the number of residency permits issued to U.S. citizens. Portugal is a clear example. In just a few years, the American community there has reportedly grown by several 100%. That's not a tiny fluctuation. That looks like a structural change. Ireland and Germany have also recorded record inflows of Americans. Applications by U.S. citizens for British and Irish passports have hit historic highs. Even the number of people going through the complicated process of giving up U.S. citizenship, a process that requires forms, fees, and serious long-term commitment, spiked around key political moments in 2024, ahead of Donald Trump's return to office, and many observers say that trend has continued. Crucially, these are different data sources from different countries, each measuring a slightly different behavior: residency, citizenship, renunciation, but they're all moving in the same general direction. Education tells a similar story. More than 100,000 American students are now enrolled in universities outside the United States, which is a record. At the same time, international student enrollment in the U.S., a traditional source of new talent and future residents, has fallen from earlier peaks in some periods. That matters because students often don't just study and leave. They in turn get jobs, settle down, pay taxes, and build companies. So when more Americans study abroad and fewer foreign students choose the U.S., you're seeing a shift in future human capital flows. Add in surges in U.S. passport applications, increased purchases of overseas real estate by Americans, and relocation and tax advisory firms reporting unusually high interest from U.S.-based clients, and you start to see a pattern that's hard to dismiss as coincidence. And this is where the story shifts from raw data to lived reality. Moving to another country is not as simple as moving from one U.S. state to another. Visas, residency rules, tax coordination, healthcare changes, sometimes a new language. None of that is effortless. People rarely take that on just for fun. They do it when they believe the trade-off is worth it. I recently spent time in Portugal, and the standout observation wasn't just that there were a lot of Americans, it was the profile of who they were. Most of them were not recent graduates on a one-year adventure. They were parents with kids enrolled in local schools. They were professionals in their 30s, 40s, and 50s working remotely or creating new businesses. They were retirees who had sold property in the U.S. and didn't seem eager to move back. When I asked why they moved, the answers sounded less like political speeches and more like spreadsheets. I don't want to think about someone carrying a gun at the grocery store. I don't want my children practicing lockdown drills. I don't want one health emergency to undo 20 years of saving. I just feel calmer here. That last phrase, feeling less stressed, came up repeatedly. In Portugal, incidents of gun violence are rare. School-related attacks are extremely uncommon. Healthcare costs, while not free in every case, are more predictable and often lower. Insurance premiums don't swing as wildly year to year. Childcare can be significantly more affordable than in many major U.S. cities, and the day-to-day pace of life is different. When you add up concerns about safety, medical bills, housing prices, and political tension, what you're really talking about is overall quality of life. None of the people I met framed their choice as "I hate America." Many still said they feel culturally American and proud of that. What they described sounded more like a risk-reward calculation. They compared healthcare systems, crime data, school environments, work-life balance, and long-term costs, and then made a decision. That's what makes this moment distinct. It doesn't feel like mass panic. It feels like strategic repositioning by people who have the ability to choose. And here's the uncomfortable economic point. The people with the mobility to relocate are often the same people who contribute heavily to local economies. Skilled workers, remote professionals, founders, two-income households. They tend to pay substantial taxes, start and fund businesses, buy property, and raise children who would eventually become part of the workforce. If that segment begins to gradually disperse to Europe, Latin America, or Asia, the impact doesn't show up all at once. It accumulates. Over years, it can influence labor markets, school enrollments, innovation hubs, and overall growth rates. So we have two layers of evidence. The numbers suggest more Americans are establishing lives abroad. Personal stories suggest many are doing it to gain stability, safety, and predictability. But that still leaves a core question. What's driving this most strongly? Politics, economics, or long-term structural issues? It's easy to say, this is all political, and point to a single election cycle or a single administration. Politics clearly matters, and we'll come to that. But if we stop the analysis there, we miss pressures that have been building for more than a decade. Start with housing. In many large and mid-sized U.S. cities, home prices have climbed far faster than wages. For many young families, the idea of buying a starter home within commuting distance of work feels out of reach. Rents have consumed larger shares of income. Entry-level homes are scarce in a lot of markets. Then consider healthcare. Even families with insurance often deal with high premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket maximums that can turn a routine medical issue into a financial shock. The fear of an unexpected bill in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars is a real mental load. Childcare in some regions of the U.S. rivals and sometimes exceeds in-state college tuition. Student loans shape major life decisions well into people's 30s and 40s, delaying home purchases, family planning, and business creation. Overlay all of that with a work culture that often expects long hours, limited paid parental leave, and fewer guaranteed social protections compared with other wealthy countries. Burnout is not just a buzzword. It's a recurring theme in surveys. When Gallup asked Americans whether they would move permanently to another country if they had the chance, about 20% said yes. During the 2008 financial crisis, one of the worst economic downturns in recent memory, that number was closer to 10%. It has roughly doubled. The key phrase in that question is, if they had the chance. Many people do not. Immigration systems are complex, moving is expensive, careers can be location-bound, and family obligations are real. So if 1 in 5 say they would relocate if they could, it suggests that the underlying desire to leave is much larger than the visible flow. At the same time, those more than 100,000 American students studying overseas are building networks and familiarity outside the U.S. much earlier in life. For them, the idea of building a career in Berlin, Lisbon, or Dublin doesn't feel exotic. It feels normal. Meanwhile, in some periods, fewer foreign students have been choosing the U.S. than during past peaks, reducing one of the country's traditional sources of new talent. When you have more Americans going out and, at times, fewer newcomers coming in, that's not just noise. Over time, it can reshape the demographic and skills landscape. This is why we have to start thinking of this less as a temporary lifestyle trend and more as a potential structural shift. And structural issues like housing affordability, healthcare costs, childcare, and student debt usually aren't fixed in a single election cycle. For many people, moving abroad isn't a protest vote. It's a form of risk management. That said, politics still plays a role, and for some people it has acted like an accelerant poured onto already dry kindling. Donald Trump's return to the presidency and his second term have come with tougher enforcement on immigration, expanded deportations, and higher tensions around universities and speech. Supporters see these as measures to reinforce law, order, and national control. Critics worry that they create uncertainty and chill around institutions that historically drove U.S. innovation and attracted global talent. Wherever you land politically, perception often drives behavior as much as reality. And a segment of Americans clearly perceives the country as more volatile now than it felt 10 or 15 years ago. That's where the nickname Donald Dash comes from, the idea that Trump's second term pushed people who were already contemplating a move to finally take action. Around his swearing in, reported renunciations of U.S. citizenship rose. Online forums about relocating lit up. Inquiries about overseas real estate and alternative residencies surged. But it's important to keep this in perspective. Trump did not create expensive housing, the structure of U.S. healthcare, student debt, or rising childcare costs. Those trends were already in motion. What his political return may have done for some people is signal that the underlying trajectory they worry about is not just a brief detour. Historically, large-scale emigration tends to happen when people lose confidence in a country's stability, economic, political, or institutional. During the Great Depression, some Americans left in search of work elsewhere. People escaped Nazi Germany, Communist Cuba under Castro, Venezuela under Chavez, and more recently, Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. In many of those stories, the United States has been the destination, the place people run to, not from. That's part of what makes the current pattern so striking. We're not talking about a collapse or a humanitarian emergency. We're talking about a slower erosion of confidence among people who, objectively, have options. Confidence is hard to measure, but it matters. When professionals start to believe that over the next 10, 20, or 30 years, their safety, healthcare security, and family life might be better in another country, some of them act on that belief. Not overnight, but steadily. The real question isn't, is America collapsing? It's, are enough people feeling enough friction that moving abroad feels like a rational decision rather than a drastic one? Once that mindset takes hold in social circles, the inertia changes. If your friend relocates to Lisbon, your coworker moves to Berlin, your cousin settles in Dublin, the psychological barrier to considering it yourself gets lower. That's often how demographic shifts begin. Quietly, one household at a time, well before headline statistics catch up. Now, let's connect this to something that's already a major talking point in business and policy circles: population and growth. Over the past several years, Many influential voices have warned about declining birth rates in advanced economies, including the US. The argument is straightforward. If the working age population shrinks, it's harder to sustain innovation, tax systems, pensions, and healthcare programs like Social Security and Medicare. But total population doesn't only grow through births. It also grows through people moving in and shrinks when people move out. If a country makes it harder for new immigrants to arrive while a growing number of its own citizens quietly leave, it's constricting both ends of its demographic pipeline. Even if only a small percentage of working-age professionals leave each year, engineers, healthcare providers, entrepreneurs, remote tech workers, the loss compounds over time. You're not just losing their current tax payments. You're losing the businesses they might have built, the jobs they might have created, and the children they might have raised within your borders. Those future children don't vanish. They're simply born and raised in some other country. From a demographic standpoint, that's not just slower growth. It's a reallocation of human capital. Many demographers have argued that, given U.S. fertility trends, maintaining a stable workforce would likely require increasing legal immigration, not reducing it. Historically, immigration has been America's demographic safety valve. It has helped offset aging populations, fueled innovation, and supported industries from technology and healthcare to higher education. So when political rhetoric and policy focus heavily on limiting entry at the same time that more Americans are exploring exits, you create a long-term tension that can't be solved with slogans. You can't express concern about an aging society while simultaneously narrowing the flow of both incoming and, indirectly, outgoing workers without consequences. Programs like Social Security and Medicare depend on a broad base of current workers supporting retirees. Economic growth in advanced economies leans heavily on talent density. How many skilled, educated, innovative people are building and investing in your country? If Americans with the most mobility are leaving, and fewer newcomers are able to arrive to replace them, the base of that pyramid gets narrower. That pressure doesn't explode in a single year. It builds into funding gaps, labor shortages in key sectors, and slower long-term growth. To be clear, this is not an argument for open borders or simplistic fixes. Immigration policy is complex. Security, integration, and labor market dynamics matter. But demographic math is unforgiving in the long run. Countries like Japan and several European nations are already managing serious challenges linked to aging populations and limited inflows of new workers. The U.S. historically sidestepped the worst of that scenario because of both higher fertility, compared with some peers, and strong immigration. If both those cushions weaken at the same time, the buffer thins. And this brings us back to the central theme: confidence. When citizens feel that their long-term prospects, financial, social, and personal, are stronger elsewhere, they act. When potential immigrants perceive fewer opportunities or more barriers, they look to other destinations. Global mobility is easier today than at any point in history. Remote work makes it possible to earn in one country while living in another. Digital infrastructure supports cross-border businesses. Highly skilled workers often have several options on the table. So the real competition isn't just between U.S. political parties. It's between countries offering different overall life packages, healthcare models, education systems, public safety, taxation, and social stability. That doesn't mean America is destined to lose. It does mean the U.S. is now competing more directly for talent, families, and founders in a way it hasn't had to think about as urgently in the past. For decades, the assumption in many discussions was simple. People want to come here. Increasingly, individuals are running comparisons. They're looking at healthcare costs, childcare and tuition, crime statistics, parental leave policies, tax regimes, and visa options. They're literally modeling their own lives in a spreadsheet. That raises a rarely asked question. What would actually make Americans feel confident enough to stay, or to return if they've already left? Would it be more affordable health care and fewer surprise bills? Greater housing affordability near economic centers? Stronger parental leave and childcare support? Immigration and education policies that sustain innovation while maintaining order? A calmer, more predictable political environment? Because if this trend really is more than a short-lived spike, simply ignoring it won't reverse it. If you know someone who's been wondering whether all of this is just media hype or the early stage of something deeper, share this video with them. These are the kinds of conversations that are useful to have before the demographic and economic consequences become baked in. In that sense, the term Donald Dash may grab attention, but the underlying forces are bigger than any single presidency. They're about stress levels, opportunity structures, demographic realities, and how secure people feel about their futures. The U.S. still holds enormous advantages: globally respected universities, deep and liquid capital markets, a powerful culture and media ecosystem, and leadership in many areas of technology. But advantages can erode if they're treated as permanent. The real issue isn't whether a few thousand or even tens of thousands of people move abroad in 1 year. It's whether the mindset that leaving is a reasonable option spreads widely enough that the flow becomes self-reinforcing. Once that happens, reversing it is much harder than preventing it. Whenever we talk about this topic, there's a personal question that tends to follow. Would you ever leave? I understand why people ask. When you spend time analyzing trends like this, families relocating, professionals diversifying their options, students enrolling overseas, it naturally leads to self-reflection. If you have skills that travel, remote work flexibility, and access to the right visas or citizenships, it's almost inevitable that you at least consider your options. More Americans today have those pathways than in previous generations. Some qualify for dual citizenship through parents or grandparents. Others can obtain residency through digital nomad visas, investment programs, or ancestry-based rules in various countries. A generation ago, most people didn't know these pathways existed. Today, governments actively advertise them. Countries compete for high-income earners, entrepreneurs, and skilled workers. Entire service industries are built around helping Americans relocate: tax specialists, international real estate brokers, immigration lawyers, and relocation consultants, so the friction has decreased. But moving abroad isn't just a financial calculation. It's also emotional and cultural. It affects where your family lives, where your memories are, where your identity feels grounded. For many, leaving would mean trading familiarity and cultural comfort for more systemic stability and predictability. That's not an obvious trade for everyone. Personally, I'm not in the process of planning an exit, but I can absolutely see why some people are. I understand parents who are exhausted by worries around school safety. I understand families who have looked at the healthcare system and decided they don't want to risk one major diagnosis derailing everything. I understand young professionals looking at home prices and wondering if the classic American dream is realistic where they live. Recognizing these motivations doesn't require declaring that the U.S. is beyond repair. It just means acknowledging that perception shapes behavior. If enough people perceive instability, whether economic, political, or social, they will hedge. Some will diversify where they keep their assets. Some will apply for second passports or foreign residencies. Some will try a year abroad and, if it works, never come back. So, where does that leave the United States? Historically, one of America's greatest strengths hasn't just been its economic size or military power. It's been its magnetism, the belief that this is the place where ambition is rewarded, where talent has room to grow, and where the future feels open. If a meaningful number of Americans themselves start to question that story for their own lives, that's a signal leaders should take seriously. The key questions are: is this a temporary spike tied to one political and economic period, or the early stage of a longer realignment? Are we watching short-term frustration or a quieter, long-term loss of confidence? Demographic changes rarely arrive with a dramatic announcement. They accumulate. A few families here, a few students there, a handful of entrepreneurs choosing to build elsewhere. Over time, those small decisions become visible in the data. That data shapes budgets, policy debates, and economic outcomes. The U.S. is still a major global hub. It still attracts millions who dream of building a life there. But for the first time in recent memory, a growing number of its own citizens are looking outward and asking whether their next chapter might unfold somewhere else. That, in itself, is historically significant. Whether the so-called Donald Dash ends up as a brief footnote or the first chapter of a deeper demographic shift will depend heavily on what happens next, on policy choices, on economic reforms, and on whether leaders take the underlying stress points seriously. When citizens with options start exercising those options, the message is not subtle. It's a request for change. And history suggests that when those signals are ignored for too long, they don't disappear. They simply show up later in the numbers.